Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, all protocols observed. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you for postponing your lunch so that you can actually listen to a presentation on something which may seem at first glance a little obscure to you. But nonetheless, I hope the presentation is on the screen. I think it is. Nonetheless, it will give you hopefully something to think about on the way home this evening. What I want to talk to you about is the Luxembourg Rail Protocol to the Cape Town Convention. This is an international treaty which makes it easier and cheaper for the private sector to finance railway equipment. And it's in force in some countries already, about to be ratified by South Africa, and hopefully will make a real difference to the way that the railways in the SADC region work. Now, I've got very limited time, so I'm going to scramble through the slides to some extent, just so that we can get to the really interesting bit, which is at the end of the presentation, which is looking at the ramifications for the industry, and particularly for the SADC area. So, as you can see, we're an international organization. We're based in Switzerland. We're a not-for-profit organization. We comprise over 90 different stakeholders from the railway industry worldwide, and we have a lot of people actually working with us. I'm actually going to move a little bit because I can't see the slides from here, so I can't see what yours. Oh, yes, I can. I can see them here. Sorry, excuse me. Now I can see what I'm telling you. So we were set up in 1996. Our objective is to advocate for the adoption of this international treaty. We're a not-for-profit organization. I don't need to tell you that railways are important for this part of the world. There are all sorts of different good reasons why we should be investing more in the railways. And I don't need to go through all that list. You know them all. But the problem is that we have opportunities out there that we're not able to take at the moment. I'm listing there all the different new technologies that are coming through the system, exciting technologies. But this is going to require billions of dollars of investment. And the question is, how do we find that money? We know that we need to move passengers and freight to the rail. We know that the rail industry has to become more competitive. We've heard this on a number of times during the course of the last couple of days, which means better pricing, more reliability, more efficiency, more availability of rolling stock. But we're also confronted with the basic problem that governments don't have enough money. And where they do have money, they should be placing that money into the infrastructure, because that's where we desperately need upgrading of the rail system in Southern Africa. So the answer should be private credit. I often say to government officials or ministers, look, you finance building of the roads, you finance the building of the railways, but because you finance the building of the roads, does that mean you have to finance every car that runs along the roads? No. But in fact, in many cases, directly or indirectly, that's what governments are doing at the moment for rolling stock, and it makes no sense. And there should be a way out of that. So the private sector is perfectly able to take over the responsibility for financing rolling stock as long as the conditions are right. We have an urgent long-term need to invest in rolling stock. The African Integrated Rail Network is going to require billions and billions of dollars of investment into the rolling stock procurement program. One of the rather strange things about all of the African Union studies is that they focus on the infrastructure, but not on the rolling stock. But as I tell them from time to time, it's no good building the infrastructure if you haven't got the railway equipment to run on it. You can see some figures that the UN ECA produced not so long ago about the needs for just freight rolling stock, plus locomotives. We're talking just in that region alone over $50 billion. And that's just a drop in the ocean. But we have problems. Private capital should be the answer, but we've got problems because of the level of the state credit. I'm showing you a pie chart there from the OECD, where they create a risk classification schedule where they classify each country across Africa with a certain credit rating. And the best credit rating is 0. Nobody's got that. And the worst credit rating is 7. And unfortunately, 61% of countries in Africa have that credit rating, which means that finance coming in from the private sector, if it comes in at all, will be expensive. Look how this breaks down in relation to the SADC states. There are 2 states not there, by the way, for people who want to know why the Comoros and Seychelles are not on that list. They're excluded. But nonetheless, you can see the red and the brown is showing you that the vast proportion of SADC states have credit ratings either at the worst level or the next to worst level. And what that means is that a lot of creditors and also export credit agencies, and we'll come back to talk about them in a minute, but a lot of export credit agencies are struggling to provide financially sustainable solutions for investing in rolling stock. We have some fundamental problems. There are no national title or security interest registries across Africa. By the way, neither in Europe. Identifiers, the way that you identify equipment is different in many different countries. So how can you give a creditor collateral? How can you give him security on an asset if you can't identify his equipment? There's limited legal infrastructure in many cases, very little law which protects the interests of the creditor. And that means that creditors are very reluctant to put their toes in the water. And then the rules when it comes to repossession of equipment are very different in different countries. In addition, we have banks who are ready to lend money, but nonetheless have to make provisions against the loans in accordance with what is now currently Basel III, but from the next beginning of next year will be Basel IV, which will require them to allocate their own capital against their loan books. So the higher the risk, the more capital they have to allocate. And Basel IV will increase the risk weighting for asset-based financing for the banks, which means that the cost of capital for the banks is higher, therefore the cost out into the operators is higher. And we have very little commercial tracking of assets at the moment, which is really important to creditors. They would like to know where their equipment is, and most of the time they haven't a clue. And then you also have conflicts of laws. Equipment crossing borders where different laws may be applying depending on where the equipment is at the time, which makes life extremely uncertain for creditors, which all adds up to a very limited and expensive private capital market. So the Cape Town Convention, born here in South Africa, is an international treaty which sets up a mechanism for giving security for creditors, giving them a chance to be able to identify their equipment, to be able to register security interests at an international registry, and giving them rights and priorities, particularly in the case of needing to repossess equipment. Now, the idea to an operator of a creditor repossessing equipment is not very comfortable, and we hope that creditors never repossess equipment. But the fact that they know where their equipment is, and they know that they have rights to repossess the equipment is a high level of comfort for them, which reduces the risk and therefore reduces the cost. So this is what opens the way for asset-based rather than debtor-based financing, which is the way out of this doom loop that unfortunately Africa is in at the moment. The Cape Town Convention covers 3 types of interests: collateral for secured credit, where you're pledging an asset as collateral for a loan; leases, whether operational leases, finance leases, one-day leases, 30-year leases, and conditional sale agreements. And the convention applies, or seeks to apply, its rules to different classes of assets through different protocols. The aircraft protocol has been in force since 2006. It's been hugely successful. It's now been adopted by well over 80 countries, including 26 states in Africa. And it has actually resulted in lower credit costs and much easier cross-border operations. The Rail Protocol was the product of the diplomatic conference that took place in Luxembourg in 2007. That's why it's called the Luxembourg Rail Protocol. It was attended by many states from Africa, and the sponsoring organizations are 2 intergovernmental organizations. And what it does is that it applies the Cape Town Treaty to all railway rolling stock, very broadly defined. It's every vehicle that runs on tracks or above, on, or under a guideway. So it's not just conventional locomotives and wagons, passenger wagons, freight wagons. It's also things like rail trains, metro trains, people movers at airports, tamping equipment that's running on tracks. Can be very expensive. It applies to all of that. Here's just some examples. I just want to point out to you that that picture of the horse-drawn tram, it's the tram that's covered by the protocol, but not the horse. So the Luxembourg Protocol creates a new global rail system, a new system for securing the rights of creditors. Those rights are registrable 24/7 through the internet on an international registry, which can be accessed by everyone publicly whenever they wish. It also introduces a new unique rail vehicle identification system called ORVIS, which we'll come to in a second. And it particularly creates a new level of security for creditors in the case of debtor default or debtor insolvency. So I'm not going to take you through every bit of the slide, but you can see there that it's a new financing tool that is delivering new and actually quite exciting benefits to the railway industry. As far as financial benefits are concerned, we commissioned a study by an independent economist company called SARA. We have a detailed study, you can see it on our website. They estimated that the benefit, the pure microeconomic benefit of the treaty in Africa ranged between 1.6% and over 13% of the value of the rolling stock being financed. And that depends obviously on the credit rating in the country concerned. But that translates into a huge amount of money. And that's just the simple, direct microeconomic benefits. The macroeconomic benefits aren't even computed. So, for example, we know that road traffic accidents are costing Africa somewhere in the region of 2 to 3% of GDP. If we can move more freight and more passengers across the rail system, that will result in a significant saving for African economies. But that's not computed in this calculation. The treaty went into force on 8th of March this year, International Women's Day. And what you're seeing there is the formal presentation by the head of OTIF to the head of UNIDROIT of a certificate saying that the international registry is ready to operate. It's currently in force in 4 states, one of which is in Africa, but I'm pleased to say that South Africa is on the point of ratifying. It's gone through cabinet, it's gone through parliament, and we're just waiting for the formal instrument of ratification to be presented to UNIDROIT. And we have other countries coming along, as you can see, and we're also talking to other countries within the SADC region to encourage them to move forward with adoption of the protocol. It's had full support from both the African Union and the UN. At the AU Transport Ministers meeting last September in Zanzibar, we had a ringing endorsement recommending that states go forward and ratify the protocol. So when, I hope you will, you go and talk to your ministers or government officials, say they need to move forward with the protocol, unless they're in South Africa when they're already doing it, then you can quote that as a basis for moving forward. And the convention and the aircraft protocol is already in force in 26 states in Africa, which should make it much easier to adopt the rail protocol. So the rail protocol brings 3 major innovations. Firstly, the international registry. For the first time, we have a global registry where parties can register their security interest. Secondly, the ORVIS number, which is the unique rail vehicle identification number. And thirdly, the permanent marking of the railway rolling stock, a system regulating how that actually should work. So the international registry is now fully functioning. You can go into their website and see what they're doing. And it's the first global public registry registering interests in rolling stock, operating in the cloud, nominally from Luxembourg, but in fact, it's operating in the cloud. So not only is it registering security interests, but it's also acting as a repository for other things, declarations, for example, in certain cases. And it's also, for example, allocating the ORVIS numbers. It's giving all sorts of other information out to people going into the website. The Orvis number, well, the Orvis number is part of the theme of the makeup of the Luxembourg Protocol, and the reason is because you've got to be able to uniquely identify the asset before you can register a security interest against it. And if the details, if the identification of the asset's changing, then it makes the life of the creditor impossible. I once had a discussion at one of these conferences with a previous head of NRZ. His name was Mike Karakadjisi. I always pronounce it wrongly. He was an Air Commodore, but he understood the railway industry very well. And I said to him, Mike, you buy a locomotive from Transnet, and it comes over the bike bridge, and it's got a number painted on the side of the wagon, of the locomotive. What do you do? And he said, oh, it's easy. I paint out that number, and I put my own number on there. Well, think of yourself as a creditor. How do you feel as a banker lending on an asset which you can no longer identify? So the ability to identify equipment uniquely and permanently is absolutely critical for the way that this whole security system will work. And what happens is that the International Registry will issue on demand 16-digit numbers. Once issued, they will never be issued again, and they should then be affixed permanently to the railway rolling stock. So it applies to all rolling stock, and indeed, it's also possible that it can be used for components for rolling stock. Although you cannot register an international interest against it, you can still use it as a mechanism for giving creditors security that there are unique identifications for wheel sets or braking, or perhaps even one day we may see it being used for containers. It's a voluntary system, but when the international registry is being used and an international interest, a security interest, is being registered, then at that point it becomes mandatory. You have to permanently mark the equipment. Otherwise, the creditor is not sure of his security. But we had a problem. The international treaty, as it was, the protocol, did not set out how you had to mark the rolling stock, and it had to be permanent. So about 3 years ago, the UN set up its own working group of experts to advise on how we should establish a minimum set of standards for permanently marking railway rolling stock. The result was a set of model rules which came out last year called the UN Model Rules on Permanent Identification of Railway Rolling Stock. And there's also some guidance notes as to how they should operate. These rules are being revised annually. And don't be deceived by the UNECE. All UN member states have the right to participate in the revision process. So South Africa, Zimbabwe have equal rights as other countries that are members of the UNECE. So it sets up a new global set of minimum standards, not very high at the moment, for marking the railway rolling stock. The keepers will need to comply with those standards, and when you register the international interest at the registry, the party making the registration will have to confirm that those standards are being complied with. At its simplest form, this is what it could look like. A plate, 15 by 10 centimeters, very simple, but that's the minimum. You can put more on it. There are also other possibilities. For example, this is a box that's being used in Europe, produced by Nexiot, where they will put the number in the chip inside the box as well as on the outside. We know that this is a developing area of work. So let's look at the exciting bits, the ramifications for Southern Africa. Well, we know that it's going to stimulate new sources of capital, both financing new acquisitions, but also don't forget existing fleets. It's not restricted, the protocol's not restricted to new equipment. So fleets can be refinanced with the benefit of the protocol, taking into account the higher comfort that you're giving to creditors and therefore hopefully the lower funding rates. But the financing should also result in not just better financing rates, but also lower transaction costs, because you will have a standard system, and it doesn't matter where you are. As most countries begin to adopt the protocol, the system will be the same, which will make the documentation much easier. And most importantly, we expect to see cheaper export credit support. Now, this is an ongoing battle, I have to tell you. There is a group of export credit agencies under the auspices of the OECD And they, including the United States, Canada, all of the EU, Britain, Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and so on. And they have a gentleman's agreement, and I'm not making this up. It's actually called a gentleman's agreement as to how they finance or how they provide credit support for exports from their individual countries. And what the agreement says is that when they are financing aircraft with the benefit of the Cape Town Convention, they discount their risk premiums by 10%. And they have not yet committed to do this on the rail protocol. Now, up until now, with the protocol not yet in force, they could say, well, we'll consider it when it happens. Today, the protocol is already in force, and it'll be operating here in South Africa within the next few months. So we are hoping to point out, and we are already pointing out to the export credit agencies, the fact that they have to be even-handed. It is outrageous that they are subsidizing financing of aircraft and not financing of rolling stock. That has to change. And not only should they be giving a 10%, we would argue that they should be giving a discount of 20%. And of course, for countries in the SADC area with a relatively poor credit rating, that discount is actually much higher because the premium is much higher because of the credit rating of the state. So that will be a big big step forward for Southern Africa. But it also creates a mechanism for state-operated entities, state-owned entities, to be able to take their assets off balance sheet, to actually begin to think creatively as to how they can get on with the job of providing transportation and not be an asset manager, perhaps simply hive off the fleets into separate entities, which may be government-owned, or they may be partially owned by the private sector, partially owned by government, and then finance that fleet in a separate way with the financial markets, with the capital markets. So it's potentially a very powerful tool for state-owned enterprises. But it will deliver cheaper credit, both for customers within countries like South Africa when the protocol is applying, and also outside of South Africa. The problem today is not that people don't need rolling stock. The problem today is they don't have money to pay for it. And time and again, manufacturers and operators tell me this. So if the private sector can now come in and provide the cash, then that opens out some very positive dynamics for the rail industry. It provides legal support for PPP projects. We've talked about some of these over the last couple of days, where the private sector and the public sector should work together. But in particular, just looking at for example, the Lobito corridor. Why should government be financing the rolling stock running on the Lobito corridor? It should be financed by the private sector. As long as the conditions are right, they will do it, and they will do it at a financially sustainable rate. It also lays the groundwork for what is, in the medium to long term, considered to be the objective of the African rail system, which is to gradually move across to standard gauge. That's going to mean an enormous investment in rolling stock, and it will open up the way not just for private sector finance to come in, but also for rolling stock to come in from other parts of the world, not necessarily new. Remember, 60% of the entire rail world runs on standard gauge. So there's a lot of equipment out there that could come to Africa, 10-year-old locomotives, let's say, which are perfectly serviceable. And once that system is operating, once the opportunities of standard gauge are operating, then we can use that. It's a key element for open access. And I'm not going to go through all the different elements of it, but it forms part of the whole open access system. And for that reason, if not for any other reason, the South African government has been very supportive of the protocol. It creates the common rules that will facilitate easier cross-border operation. We've all been listening this morning, to corridors, to how you facilitate easier collaboration between operators. This is one of the solutions because you have a common system. And it allows real-time tracking, both for the operator to understand how his equipment is operating, but also for the creditor. Most creditors do not know where their equipment is, even if they're taking it as security. They need to know. They need to know just in case they need to repossess the equipment, but otherwise they need to know because it gives them a lot more comfort and they can ensure that any possible geographic restrictions they're putting on the operation of the rolling stock are actually being adhered to. This opens the door for that. We're not there yet. We're going to have digital solutions in the coming years, which will make it a lot easier for the creditor industry, for the finance industry, to be able to get involved. And of course, interoperability. When you've got the same system operating, same finance system, you've got the same identification system, it makes life an awful lot easier. So it forms a key part of the program for regional integration across Africa, supporting cross-border operations, standardizing conditions, and it's going to provide very important support for the AFCFTA, for the African Integrated Rail Network, and just look, one of the examples, one of the pilot projects will be the Trans-Kalahari line. That will need finance. We know the cost of actually building the line is immense. The cost of the rolling stock is going to be even more. We need to bring in private capital to be able to finance that. And most importantly, it opens the way for collaboration, both between operators and, for that matter, between finance companies and even regulators. So looking forward, and this is the last bit of the presentation, looking forward, 3 big things we need to look at. One is get states to ratify the Luxembourg Protocol. It's easy. It doesn't cost government money. It's really just a question of adopting the protocol, bringing it into national law. And you can see those countries marked in blue. They've already adopted the Cape Town Convention and the Aircraft Protocol. So why should they adopt the Aircraft Protocol and not the Rail Protocol? Makes no sense. And it makes it easier because they've probably been through the legislative process already. So we need to urge our governments to move forward with the adoption of the protocol. Secondly, we need to work together beating up the export credit agencies. They won't move unless we tell them. But we have to make our case and shame them, if necessary, into providing cheaper risk premiums, which makes, in turn, the financing of rolling stock being exported from various parts of the world into Africa cheaper. And we also need to encourage other countries that are not part of the OECD network, including ECIC, to adopt a similar system. And then, looking forward, we need to work together on procurement, work together on manufacturers marking equipment with the Orvis number right from the outset as it comes off the production line, and look more innovatively as to how we can use the protocol to create a much more sustainable model for the railways in southern Africa, whether it's setting up leasing pools, setting up joint venture operations, setting up standard operating leases that can be used in different parts of the region, negotiating group finance packages with the big banks, negotiating procurement packages. A manufacturer will always give you a better price if you're buying 1,000 units and not 100 units. So it gives us the opportunity to work together across the region to actually get a much better value for money when procuring equipment. And it will create a platform for a secondary market in rolling stock, which has its own major benefits. So the key takeaways are 2. The Luxembourg Protocol will provide easier and cheaper finance coming in from the private sector as soon as it's enforced in the country where the debt is located. And it applies to new and existing fleets and all types of rolling stock. And it will therefore reduce the pricing, which will help the rail industry be more competitive against the road industry and hopefully grab more market share because it can be more competitive. And with the new Orvis identification system and the UN model rules of marking railway equipment, it opens up whole new possibilities for an integrated rail system. So we need to support that, and we need your support to go back to your governments, to go back to your government officials, to tell them this is easy, this is not rocket science, but you need to move forward, adopt the protocol, and create the conditions whereby the private sector can come in and play a meaningful role in the way that we develop the rail industry in the coming decades. Thank you.